Olá, buenas noches a todos. Es un placer estar acá con usted. Vamos a empezar presentando a la doctora J Laningan, que va nos a presentar una conferencia sobre el prevención y tratamiento de la obesidad en idade pediátrica. La doctora J Laningan es profesora asociada del Childhood Nutrition Research Center, University College of London, Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, Londres, Inglaterra. Ella es directora e investigadora principal del Dream Thoughts Community Interest Company del UCL y también tiene más de 50 publicaciones en el tema de obesidad en niños. Ella lleva 25 años trabajando en UCL. Entonces, vamos a acompañar la presentación y después tenemos algún tiempo para una discusión y algunas encuestas.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I'd like to talk to you today about the prevention and treatment of overweight and obesity in early life. So as we all know, I'm sure childhood obesity is probably the most serious nutrition-related disease facing today's children. And it's associated with adverse effects on health, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. And importantly, it's hard to treat and difficult to reverse once it becomes established. So it tracks through childhood and into adult life, where it's associated with increased risk of serious diseases. So it's agreed that obesity starts early in childhood, and most excess childhood weight is in fact gained during the preschool years, so before children even start school. And WHO reports that about 41 million children globally around the world under the age of 5 are affected by having excess weight or rapid weight gain. So the objectives of today's talk are to try and understand the risk factors for childhood overweight and obesity, to have an appreciation of the possible mechanisms underpinning its development, and to gain some knowledge of interventions and evidence of the effectiveness of interventions for reducing the risk of obesity and for managing excess weight gain. So we're going to start by looking at prevention and looking at those risk factors for obesity. So as we all know, at its simplest, overweight and obesity result when there's an energy imbalance. So when energy intake from the food that we eat is greater than the expenditure that we need to go about our daily activities and for growth and repair. And we know that it's a really complex interaction between our genes and the environment. So we know that its susceptibility is important. How susceptible our genes make us really matters, because we know that the risk of a child having overweight or obesity is much higher if one or both parents are affected. And in fact, up to 70% of risk is estimated to be heritable. And many genes have been identified as being associated with the risk of obesity. At the last count, there were more than 100 genetic markers that are linked to having a higher BMI. And these come from really looking at genome-wide or gene-wide association studies. So there are many genes implicated in the risk of having obesity. But what's interesting is that all these genes that have so far been identified, when you put them all together, they account for only a very small proportion of the variation in BMI, so about 3%. So in other words, there are lots of genes that are having very small effects. And we know that obesity is a polygenic disease that's influenced by many genes. And of course, these genes cannot be changed. They're part of us. We inherit them. So it must be the environment around us that's having the greatest impact, because not everybody who has the genes becomes overweight. So really those genes confer a susceptibility, but not a certainty. So we need to look to our environment. And we look at that energy balance equation. We know that it's an imbalance between the energy that's taken in, and that of course comes from our diet, from the foods that we eat, both the quantity and the quality of those foods. And on the other hand, the amount of expenditure, so the physical activity and our day-to-day growth and repair. So when we look at physical activity at that side of the equation, it's no surprise that low physical activity is linked to a higher risk of having overweight or obesity. And in our very youngest children, it's recommended that they're active for at least 3 hours daily. In the UK, that's the recommendation for preschool children. And it sounds like they should be exercising for 3 hours per day. But what we really mean is that children need to be active. So playing and going about their day-to-day activity. So that's not being driven around or put in buggies all the time, but encourage them to be active and to be walking and running around. And higher sedentary behaviours, so the time children spend sitting is important as well. And that's independently linked to increased risk of obesity. So it's not just about being physically active, it's also about not spending too much time seated and not moving around. So overweight then is strongly associated with lower levels of physical activity and to higher time spent sedentary. And that's usually higher time TV viewing, so playing screen games, looking at screens for entertainment. And not surprisingly, higher TV viewing in children, as with adults, is linked to a higher passive intake of energy-dense foods. So we know that when children sit down to watch TV, they're more likely to eat more snacks, have more sugary drinks, and these have also been shown in systematic reviews and studies to be linked to a higher risk of having overweight and obesity. So when we look at those two sides of the energy equation, we see that by far the greatest impact, the greatest contribution to the energy imbalance is from diet. And it's estimated that around about 80% of the risk of obesity or energy imbalance comes through the dietary channel, and only 20% is related to reduced physical activity. But that's not to say that physical activity isn't important, because of course it has very important impact on our overall health. And we all know as well that it's far easier to take in extra calories in the form of food than it is to burn them off in terms of physical activity. So one chocolate covered biscuit, for example, may give us an extra 70 to 100 calories, and that can take us half an hour of brisk walking to burn off. So as well as these simple risk factors, this energy imbalance, more recently, we've come to realize that developmental factors really are important in the development of overweight and obesity. And so it's a life course approach that's needed, and we need to start looking even before pregnancy and during pregnancy. So we know that it's really important for a mother to enter pregnancy at a healthy body weight. So we know that being overweight on entering pregnancy or during pregnancy is linked to having an overweight child. So both being overweight, gaining weight rapidly, having gestational diabetes, which again is associated with excess weight in pregnancy, and smoking, all of these developmental factors have been shown to be linked to an increased risk of obesity in the infant and young child. And that, of course, can be carried through later in life. So developmental risk factors are important. And we can do much about postnatal life as well. So being born big is related to obesity risk, growing rapidly, or having a high weight during infancy and early childhood. So importantly, postnatally, we can do things to influence the risk. So there are, of course, nutritional risk factors that are important. So how a child is fed right from the beginning matters. Infant feeding plays an important role. We know that breastfeeding compared to formula feeding has a protective effect against the risk of rapid weight gain and later obesity. The complementary feeding period is also important. So the age at which children are introduced to solids, that's been investigated in some detail. And also the type and quantity, the type and amount of foods that children are given is important. So let's look first of all at the sole milk feeding period. So when infants are fed, breastfeeding gives a moderate protective effect against the development of excess weight and later obesity, but it's a small effect, roughly about 10 to 15% of a protective effect. And formula-fed infants are at increased risk. So why might that be the case? We'll go on to look at that. So evidence for a protective effect of breastfeeding is quite strong and comes from systematic reviews that have been quite consistent down the years. So this evidence is observational, so of course it's prone to confounding, but the evidence of many studies points in the same direction, showing that breastfeeding does have a moderate effect, protective effect against the development of overweight and obesity. And if you look here, it shows that it's exclusive breastfeeding that's really important, and for the recommended duration as well. So the protective effect seems to be strongest up to about 6 months, when the WHO recommends that we carry on exclusive breastfeeding for. So it's important to breastfeed exclusively and for at least 6 months if possible, and evidence strongly supports that. So I want to look now at the mechanisms underpinning rapid weight gain and obesity development. So what might be going on to drive that weight gain early in life? Well, possible mechanisms include the slower growth pattern that we see in breastfed infants compared with those formula-fed. That seems to be protective against the development of overweight. And this was put forward as a unifying hypothesis by Atul Singhal and Alan Lucas in The Lancet in 2004, who hypothesized that the protective effect of breastfeeding against obesity was due to this slower growth pattern that we see in breastfed infants. And it was also hypothesized that this could be due to the higher protein content of formula milk compared with human milk. So the early protein hypothesis proposes that high protein early in life, and particularly a high concentration of branch chain amino acids, as seen in infant formula, has a growth promoting effect by stimulating insulin and insulin-like growth factors. So this in turn signals growth and promotes weight gain and fat deposition. So collectively, these factors could increase obesity risk in the child. So high protein in early life may have a programming effect. So by this programming, we mean a stimulus or insult at a critical point in development. And here we mean nutrition is the critical insult occurring in early life that's influencing growth and having a permanent effect on the structure and function of the person. So in other words, increasing susceptibility to rapid weight gain and later overweight and obesity. And this has been nicely shown in an experimental study. So this is the CHOP study, or the European Study on Obesity, where higher protein intake was shown to lead to faster growth and increased risk of obesity in formula-fed infants. And this is one of the only solid pieces of evidence we really have to support this hypothesis. So in this study, infants were randomized during the first year of life, either to receive a standard infant formula with 1.3 grams of protein during the first 6 months of life, or a higher protein formula with 2.1 grams of protein per 100 mils. And this would increase during the second year, second 6 months of infancy. So we'd have a standard formula, follow-on formula, compared with a higher protein formula. And these infants were followed up later on in childhood, and their growth patterns were different. So you can see here that infants who were fed the higher protein formula had the higher BMI, both at 12 and 24 months of life. So this is both in terms of weight for length here, but also their body mass index here. So those who were given the lower protein formula, or the standard formula in this case, had a growth pattern more similar to the breastfed reference group shown here. So what we're seeing here is that higher protein had an increased risk of obesity in children up to 1 year of age. That was significant. The effect was still there later at 2 years of age. However, the effect size had diminished, and this could suggest a programming effect where infants were programmed to grow more rapidly. The effect decreased, which is shown in lots of animal studies, but nevertheless, a programming effect was suggested. But to really know if this was happening, of course, a longer term follow-up is needed. And these infants were followed up until they were preschool age. So between 4 and 6 years of age, the effect was still seen to be there. So you can see here that there were more children in the higher protein group in the overweight category. So these were children with a BMI above the 95th centile. So here we see the children fed the standard formula and the breastfed reference group. So this is showing us quite clearly that there are more overweight and obese children in the group given the higher protein formula. So this study really is one of the first to support the idea that higher protein during early life does predispose to a risk of rapid weight gain and later obesity. So what could be going on here with the protein effect? Well, it's been proposed that higher protein in infancy could lead to faster growth or growth acceleration. And by this, we mean rapid upward centile crossing. So it's not like the normal catch-up growth where we see a sick child who falters and their weight or growth falls away from the centile and then they catch up. What we're seeing is a continuous one-directional growth in early life as a child up centiles. And one possibility is that this fast growth is programming appetite. So not surprisingly, humans are programmed to respond to a high plane of nutrition. So if nutrition is there, the child will eat more, and in that way, their forming endocrine system will be programmed to have a higher appetite later on in life. So that's one possible mechanism that could be underpinning this. So nutrition is one important mechanism in its own, but nutrition combined with behavioural factors is probably what's working together to increase the risk. So studies have also looked at infant feeding behaviours. So early studies have shown that infants who have a more avid feeding style, who suck more avidly, who empty their bottle more readily, they're more likely to grow rapidly and have a higher risk of rapid weight gain and overweight and obesity. Parents also play a role, so not just the infant feeding style, but the parental feeding style, how they feed their child, how well they respond to infant feeding cues, all matter. So behaviour as well as nutrition are part of the mechanism driving rapid weight gain. So we can look at this in terms of appetite and obesity. So some early studies by Agras and colleagues way back in the 90s investigated the sucking rate of infants and showed that those who sucked more rapidly, who took more sucks per minute of either breast milk or bottle milk, all had higher adiposity later in childhood. Also more avid bottle emptying. So studies by Lee and colleagues showed that infants who emptied their bottles more readily, and that was regardless of the type of milk in the bottle, so it could have been human milk or formula, they were more prone to be those same children who cleaned their plates later in life. So high milk drinkers become high food eaters and have higher risk of obesity later on in life. These patterns of eating tend to track through childhood. So, and there's strong evidence to suggest that this is indeed what's happening. So how can we overcome this? Well, one recommended way of controlling overeating in young children is to practice responsive feeding. So this is where a feeder, a mother or a caregiver responds appropriately to infants' cues of fullness or hunger. So several feeding styles have been described, and these are termed permissive, neglectful, authoritative, or authoritarian. And the one that's most conducive with healthy weight gain is what we call an authoritative feeding style. And this is where a mother shows a high level of responsiveness to her infant's demandingness, so responds appropriately and interprets correctly whether the infant is asking for food or simply for comfort. So this authoritative feeding style is showing us responsive feeding. So this is where the mother responds appropriately to those cues, and in that case, you're more likely to get healthy growth. So with inappropriate responses, so unresponsive feeding, when a bottle might be offered and a mother might or caregiver might encourage a child to empty a bottle, this could be considered a less appropriate feeding style that's shown to be linked to more rapid growth and more tendency to become overweight. So to summarise that, authoritative feeding styles and responsive feeding are protective against obesity. And this is shown in many systematic reviews where observational studies have been combined to show that a responsive feeding style is protective against the risk of obesity. So not surprisingly then, responsive feeding is encouraged, and researchers have investigated the effects of responsive feeding against the development of obesity. And we've got several studies that we can look at, several randomized trials where interventions to encourage responsive feeding have been compared against usual care. So the Nourish feeding trials, randomized controlled trials in infants, carried out from the complementary feeding period, and the Healthy Beginnings trial, also carried out in Australia, have had some positive effects, and a later study as well, the Insight study carried out in the USA, which intervened earlier, are all examples of responsive feeding studies. So I just want to look at those in a little bit more detail now. So as I mentioned, the Nourish trial carried out in South Australia, this was an intervention that happened from complementary feeding and encouraged parents and caregivers to introduce complementary feeds in a timely way, so not too early, advised on the foods that were most appropriate at this time, and found that this kind of complementary feeding, following guidelines, led to lower BMI and improved feeding behaviours at 1 year of age. Interestingly, when these children were then followed up a year later, the effect disappeared. So there was no difference between those children who'd had that intervention and who'd been assigned to usual care. So this didn't seem to be very promising for the long run. It had short-term effects, but didn't seem to influence or program long-term behaviours. The Healthy Beginnings study followed children up for slightly longer, and again found that slower weight gain in the first year of life, and there were fewer children who were overweight at 2 years of age. But again, when these children were followed up to preschool age, the effect size had disappeared and diminished, so it was no longer significant. So it seemed that intervening from complementary feeding may not be soon enough. So on the other hand, this trial in America, the Insight study, which stands for Intervention Nurses Start Infants Growing on a Healthy Trajectory, and this was carried out from soon after birth, so from the start of the infancy period. So this study found that sending nurses into the home right from the beginning to give advice on responsive feeding, appropriate complementary feeding, led to slower growth up to 1 year later. And that children in the intervention group had a lower BMI at 1 year of age. And importantly, so far, this study has shown that this effect has been sustained, and that at 3 years of age, so at preschool age, children who were randomized to the intervention group still had a lower risk of overweight and obesity on starting preschool. Interestingly, in this group, the benefits were seen in breast and formula-fed infants, so suggesting that responsive feeding is important in children both who are breastfed or formula-fed, and that growth independently affects the risk. So it's not just nutrition, but it's also growth, rapid growth, that's likely to be driving this increased risk of overweight and obesity. So the question is, why may this Insight trial have been more effective? Why might programming have worked here? And the idea is that the intervention started early from birth and that growth was slowed right from the beginning. So it's possible that growing more slowly programmed appetite in a more healthy way. So it didn't program to a higher plane of nutrition. And therefore these children, and we're talking about children who are born largely in developed countries here, who don't have a shortage of food, so are likely to have a higher appetite that will put them at a disadvantage through childhood and through life, are likely to have a lower risk of obesity if we can control that programming effect during infancy. So it does seem encouraging. So let's just move on to look now beyond infancy at the preschool period. is that also a critical period when nutrition and behaviours are important. And research available so far suggests that the preschool years are indeed a critical period for establishing dietary habits. We know that dietary patterns become established by the age of 3 years, and that once they are established, they track through childhood, so they're carried forward. Those studies, for example, in the UK, we have the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, which has lots of information on diets very early in life. And these studies show the importance of dietary patterns. So by the age of 3, dietary patterns can be described in children that may be more healthful, maybe more convenience food-based, more snack food-based. And we know that once they're established, they tend to track through childhood. And also importantly, they're associated with risk of obesity. So the more healthful diets, not surprisingly, being related to a lower risk of having a high weight compared with those less healthy, energy-dense diets that children might be following. So we have many aspects to consider. So we also have to look not just at dietary patterns, but the quantity of foods in the diet and the quality. So we need to look at the energy content of the preschool diet. We need to look at the specific foods and beverages that they may be taking to excess or not having enough of. Portion size is also important, and we need to get that right from the beginning. And also we need to ask, are there any specific nutrients that are important during this early stage of life? So when we think about the amount of energy in the diet, we need to think about the total energy, and that really relies on the amount of foods, but also on the energy density of the foods. So children of this age naturally need quite energy dense foods because they have small stomachs. We don't want to fill them up with too much roughage, too much bran, high fibre foods. We've got to give them enough, but also make sure that there's enough room in the stomach to take the foods that will provide the energy. So we need to make that balance between energy density as well. What about specific foods? So cow's milk is implicated during the 2nd year of life. So we know that cow's milk is associated having a lot of cow's milk, so having more than 500 mils per day as a drink beyond that 1st year of infancy is related to a higher risk. We know that sugar sweetened drinks, so giving too much orange juice, too many sugary squashes, they're related to a higher risk. And high fat foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt. So really we're talking about those processed foods, and also the frequency of eating as well. So meal size and snack frequency is important, and portion size too. So studies have shown us that offering children higher portions leads to a higher intake, not surprisingly. And we know as well that this is particularly true once children get to the age of 3. So children given larger portions, they seem to regulate them before they get up to age 3. But beyond that, it seems that you can override their innate appetite control. So offering portion sizes does start to stimulate appetite once children get above the age of 3. And with regard to nutrients, as with infancy, the strongest evidence is to suggest that higher protein diets in early childhood are linked with increased risk of obesity. And we know this because studies show us that protein intake increases markedly during complementary feeding, accounting for a much higher percentage of energy. And we know that studies show us that protein intake is higher than recommendations throughout the preschool period. So why does that happen? Well, this is WHO recommendations that protein requirements during the milk feeding period. So from 6 to 12 months, protein provides about 5 to 6% of energy in the complementary feeding diet. And once they get to 1 year, to the preschool age group, about 5, and it's still a small percentage, about 5 to 8% of energy really from protein is enough. And when we look at average intakes, when we look at breastfeeding, that will provide about 5% of energy. But once complementary foods kick in the UK, for example, and many other countries, we know that the family diet from complementary feeding onwards can provide as much as 15 to 20% of energy from protein. So it clearly goes up, and a lot of this seems to come from the high cow's milk contribution in the young child diet. So to look at this in our group, we investigated studies that had data on protein intake in preschool children and infants from 6 months to 3 years of age. And when we put these studies together, we did find that children who had a higher protein intake were more at increased risk of obesity later in childhood. So we looked at studies, and out of those studies, there were 17 studies that had looked at this, and this number has increased now. And 16 of these studies were amenable for meta-analysis. So when we put all these studies together and look at high versus low protein and later BMI, so we're looking at BMI at least 6 months later than the measurement of protein intake, so we can see that time-related relationship. And there was an increased effect of 0.3 Z-scores or standard deviations in BMI for children in the highest protein group. So as with infants, it did seem that protein during this early stage of life was associated with a higher risk of overweight and obesity. So all very well looking at the risk factors. Are there any possible solutions? How do we manage this group? What can be done? So in managing weight in these young children, weight loss is not the goal, certainly in preschool children, because they're at high risk of nutritional deficiencies if we restrict their intake too much, and we don't want them growth faltering. So we're not looking at weight loss in these children. Rather, we're trying to slow the rate of growth to keep them on the centile that they've established. And if they've reached a higher centile, then to allow them to grow down to down centile and into their established centile. So the aims are then to maintain the BMI Z-score, or their BMI for age and gender, in healthy weight children, so to keep them growing along their established centile and to stop their BMI from going upwards, or to try and reduce their relative BMI in those children who've already experienced rapid growth and become overweight. So they might be high weight for their length in the youngest children, under 2, or from 2, the age of 2, we can look at their BMI. So interventions then should aim to make small changes to behaviours that mediate obesity. So these should really target diet, physical activity, sedentary time or their screen time, and more recently, sleep pattern may be important as well. So we're looking at sleep hygiene and trying to ensure children have healthy sleep patterns as well. So lifestyle interventions, we know, can be effective in reducing obesity risk in the youngest children. And systematic reviews show that you can get a small reduction in BMI, reducing BMI by about 0.1 to 0.3 Z-scores. And that may seem trivial, but when you look at a growth chart, this can have the effect of bringing a child down from the overweight BMI category to a healthier category. So it can be a third of the distance between two major centiles. And the most effective interventions are those that focus on improving dietary and physical activity behaviours. So not just looking at one side of the coin or the other. And also that include at least one family member. So in these youngest children, of course, parents and carers are their advocates. They decide how much children are going to be fed and what they're going to be fed. So it's also important to incorporate family-based therapy. And interestingly, the reviews show that it's interventions that target the youngest age groups, children under 6 years, that have the greatest effect on BMI. So it does seem that it's really important to target the youngest children to get sustained changes. And these are some of the systematic reviews. So when I first started working in prevention of overweight in preschool children, there were very few studies available back in 2006. And that's really when the first systematic review was done, published in 2007. Since then, there have been many studies with large numbers of randomized trials. And the most recent one we have is from Brown et al. And this is a Cochrane review, which looks at the effect of interventions on reducing the risk of overweight and obesity in children, and reports quite strongly that the greatest effect is seen in the youngest children. I just want to finish by going through an intervention that we've developed at the UCL Institute of Child Health in London. So we've developed an intervention and evaluated this as well. So Planet Munch was developed for preschool children and their families to meet the guidelines from our National Institute of Care Excellence in the UK. So we work together as a multidisciplinary team of dietitians, paediatricians, psychologists, and community-based artists who had experience of entertaining and engaging families, which is really important when you're delivering these complex interventions over a long period of time. And the programme also has a community and home-based element to it. So the community-based intervention takes place over 6 months, and it's every week for 2 hours. So you can see that we have to make it very interesting for children and families, very colourful. So we have art and craft sessions, music and movements where parents and children move around together so they both get active. Healthy snack, which is an opportunity to teach the principles of nutrition in a practical way and introduce families to healthy choices. We separate the parents and children to give parents more formal training in nutrition and physical activity, and then have some fun games for children. And we'll come back together at the end to stretch out, unwind, and come back together as a group. And in this way, we encourage children and families to work together. So the intervention was evaluated, and we did this using a waiting list control design, where both groups would receive the intervention. One group is randomized to immediately start, the other group to take part 6 months later. And this allows us a period when one group has had the intervention and one is waiting to compare the effects of the intervention, look at randomized comparisons. So we did 2 randomized trials. First one was in high-risk children who were already on the overweight centile or had grown rapidly, so were at increased risk. And we randomized 88 children with 52 boys and 36 girls with a mean age of 2.5 and a mean BMI of 18.5, which puts them above the overweight centile for boys here. That's the average BMI of 18 at 2.5 for a boy and equally for a girl. So the results were quite promising. So importantly, we were able to engage the families because we had the extra elements, the artistic components to our intervention. And we found that 3/4 completed, defined as attending 3/4 of sessions. And BMI Z-score was lower in children after the intervention compared with those on the waiting list. And in this high-risk group, the intervention had a large effect size, bigger than that effect size seen in systematic reviews, and possibly because these were high-risk children to begin with. Importantly, we were able to follow almost half the group up to 2 years after completion. And importantly, we found that the BMI Z-score, although the effect size was now lower, it was still reaching 1/3 of a standard deviation difference between children after they'd taken part in the intervention. So we did a second intervention in all preschool children. So by definition, this would probably still include 1/4 of children already having overweight and obesity, because we know that 1 in 4 of our preschool children starts school already having overweight. So again, we had good results with 3/4 of the children and families attending 3/4 of the sessions. And we found a very similar effect size after intervention, with a reduction of 0.3 Z-scores for children having taken part in the programme immediately after the intervention. We also compared waist circumference, blood pressure, and looked at their behavioural factors, their dietary risk factors, and benefits in all these measures were seen in children who'd taken part in the intervention. A small reduction in waist circumference and blood pressure that may not seem important at an individual level, but when you look at this as a population level, it's a big effect. So again, we managed to follow up almost half of the group, with 46% of children followed up 1 year following the intervention, and we maintained that reduction in BMI Z-score. So it looks promising that the intervention does have a longer term benefit. So just to summarise then with some take-home messages, Having excess weight in childhood, I'm sure you'll all agree, is a very serious problem. There are complex causes that we can't begin to unpick completely, but we know that the risk is early in life, is there from early in life, and that once established, it's difficult to reverse overweight and obesity, and that there are serious adverse health outcomes, both in the short and the long term for children and for adults. We know that interventions can help to reduce that risk. We need to take a life course approach, starting preconceptually and continuing through pregnancy, through the infant feeding period and the complementary feeding period, as well as in early childhood through those preschool years. So some practical advice, some take-home messages are to advise mothers to enter pregnancy at a healthy weight, to avoid excessive gestational weight gain and try to breastfeed exclusively if possible for the recommended 6 months. If they can't breastfeed or choose not to, then it's wise to try and choose a lower protein infant formula if one's available, and to practice responsive breastfeeding, whether that's breastfeeding or formula feeding. To introduce solids at a timely manner at around 6 months and not before 4 months, which seems to show an increased risk. To limit cow's milk in the UK, we say below 600 mils per day. ESPGHAN recommends no more than 500 mils per day cow's milk as a drink. And of course, it's important to establish a healthy diet that includes plant protein sources, encourage fruit and vegetables and a variety, because we know children tend to fall short on their fruit and vegetable intake compared with recommendations. To minimise sugar-sweetened drinks, and that really means keeping them for a treat and having only water or milk as the main drink during those early years of life, and to avoid oversized portions, so to get to know portion sizes and help parents to do that. I'd just like to finish by thanking all the families who took place in our Planet Munch programs and studies and other studies at the Institute of Child Health, Childhood Nutrition Research Centre. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining today and listening to this presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay. Me gustaría mucho agradecer a la doctora Julie por la excelente presentación. También agradecemos a todos los que participan en esta live. Creo que tenemos tiempo para algunas preguntas o comentarios que quieras hacer. Ok. Me parece que no tenemos ninguna pregunta. Muy bien, creo que la presentación fue muy completa. Todas las personas se quedaron a participar oyendo con las informaciones que el doctor Julia nos pasó. Entonces, me gustaría de agradecer a todos los que participaron en esta live y agradecer a la oportunidad de la participación y la coordinación de esta live por parte de ESPGHAN y LASPGHAN, y una buena noche a todos.